Okay, chapter 11, landlord tenant stuff. So, what I can tell you about this chapter is to pay heavy attention to the North Carolina specific rules in this chapter. Most of the landlord tenant type questions you'll see will be related to the specifics that are for North Carolina. So like the Residential Rental Agreements Act, the North Carolina Tenant Security Deposit Act. And we're going to go through and talk about those, but as you're studying, I would put a heavy preference on the North Carolina stuff in this chapter. So one of the first things we talk about is the difference between an estate for years and a periodic tenancy, or for period to period. An estate for years, folks, is a lease for a specific amount of time. A specific amount of time. Anytime you see a specific, I don't care if it's a day, a week, a year, but if it specifies, we rent this property for 1 year. We rent this property for 3 weeks. That is an estate for years. A periodic tenancy would always be stated as they have a 1-year lease that automatically renews as month to month, right? Because the key fact about a periodic tenancy is that it automatically what? Renews. Whereas an estate for years automatically terminates. Okay? Is everybody good on that distinction between the two? Make sure you know that. It renews after whatever the original period is. So a period-to-period tenancy, it could be for a year, and then it's going to renew to year, month-to-month, whatever it says, but it's going to renew. It could be a 1-month tenancy, but it's going to renew. The key fact about a periodic tenancy is that automatic renewal. So that when they describe it on the test, they would always say that renews to year, month-to-month. Something like that. There's going to be some statement about renewal for it to be a periodic tenancy. All residential tenancies in North Carolina are what kind of tenancy? Periodic tenancy. Mostly, estates for years are in what kind of real estate? Commercial. Most commercial leases are estates for years. Good. All right. Over on page 328, the difference between a fixed lease and a gross lease. Okay. In a fixed lease, the tenant is paying one amount of money, and who's responsible for all the upkeep, maintenance, taxes, insurance on the property? The landlord is. In a net lease, the tenant is paying rent, but they're also paying for what? Everything else. Maintenance, upkeep, taxes, insurance. So that becomes a tenant responsibility in a net lease. The difference between a gross lease and a net lease is just who's responsible for all the expenses of the property. Landlord responsibility in a gross lease, tenant responsibility in a net lease. Okay? And residential leases usually are which one of those? Gross leases. Tenant pays one amount, landlord takes care of everything else. Commercial leases are usually, which one? Net leases. Most commonly net leases and commercial leasing. Okay? Make sure you know, for example, a couple different kinds of leases. A ground lease would be when you're leasing just land in order to do what? You're going to build something on the land. So is this going to be a short-term lease or a very long-term lease? Very long-term lease. Very long-term lease. Good. Turning over to page 333, it talks about the requirement to record leases. First of all, is there a requirement to record all leases? No. They don't even have to be what? They don't even have to be written. So they certainly don't have to be recorded. What leases should be recorded? Leases that are longer than 3 years. And why is that? Who does it protect to record leases that are longer than 3 years? The tenant. Because if the property were sold, the new owner would not have to honor a lease of more than 3 years unless that lease had been what? Recorded. Okay? So make sure you remember that. Now, on the bottom of page 333, we get into the Residential Rental Agreements Act. The North Carolina Residential Rental Agreements Act. So, you need to know this stuff for sure. This governs all residential leases in North Carolina. First of all, the tenant's responsibilities are what under this lease? What should the tenant do? Not trash it. So they have to keep the property clean and safe. And then what's the big one? Pay rent. First, foremost, and always pay rent. Does the tenant ever, in a residential tenancy in this state, have the right to not pay the rent? No, they do not. Even if the landlord's not doing what they're supposed to do, does the tenant have the right to stop paying the rent? They do not. What is their right if the landlord's not doing what they're supposed to do? Constructive eviction, which is move out, leave, vacate the property. But they never have the right to stop paying rent as long as they are in the property. Now, does the landlord have some responsibilities in a residential tenancy? And what are those responsibilities? Keep it habitable. Maintain the property in what they call it a fit and habitable condition. Who's responsible for maintenance in a residential lease in North Carolina? The landlord, always. Can they negotiate away the maintenance? No, they may not. So they can't agree with the tenant, you're going to pay less rent and I'm not going to fix your heat. That's not possible. Okay, is everybody good on that? They may not negotiate away the maintenance. They always must maintain the property. Even if the tenant's behind on the rent, can they say, oh, you're 2 months behind, I'm not fixing your heat? No. No, they cannot do that. If the tenant's 2 months behind, what should they do? Kick them out, but how do we do that? What's the process called? That's called the summary ejectment. Remember, there are only 2 ways a tenant can leave a property in North Carolina. They either vacate on their own, voluntarily, or summary ejectment. Those are the only 2 ways. The only 2 ways. Is that thing making all that noise? Okay. The Tenant Security Deposit Act. Tenant Security Deposit Act on page 337. What does the Tenant Security Deposit Act regulate? It regulates how much of a security deposit you can hold, right? And what else? What you can do with the security deposit. So it regulates what I can use it for, and it regulates what I can do with it. So how much can I hold of a security deposit? What's that based on? How long the lease is. What's the longest? What's the most I can hold as a security deposit? 2 months rent, and that's if the lease is for what? Anything longer than month to month. Generally would be a year, right? But anything longer than month to month, 2 months rent is the most. Okay? What can we do with that tenant security deposit? What kinds of things can we use it for? And when? When? First of all, let's do the when. When can we use that tenant security deposit? After they move out. After they move out. That's when we can use that tenant security deposit. So what can we use it for? Damages above what? Above ordinary wear and tear. So damages outside of ordinary wear and tear. What other kinds of things can we use the security deposit for? Non-payment of rent. Cost of re-renting the property. How about court costs? Like if we have to file for summary ejectment, can we charge that against the security deposit? Sure. What do we have to do if we charge them for we take money out of their security deposit, or if we're refunding their security deposit? What do we have to do when they move out? We have to do an accounting, and how long do we have to do that accounting? 30 days after they vacate the property, after they move out. Good, good. Do you have to refund their pet fee to them? No, because it's a what? Fee. It's a fee. Can you charge a pet fee for a service animal? No, they're not pets. They're people. At least under the law they are. Okay? Let's see here. They do pay rent. Let's see. I'd say that might be it for... Oh, what does the word upfit mean? Upfit. Not upgrades. Don't use that word. That word is misleading. It's customizing. Because it might not be an upgrade. It could be just a customization, right? Don't use the word upgrade because I guarantee on a test that's going to be there and it's the wrong answer. An upfit is a customization for a specific tenant in commercial real estate. Okay? Well, a trade fixture is not an upfit because who does a trade fixture belong to? Who's installing a trade fixture? The tenant. Who's doing upfit? The landlord. Upfit is done by the landlord. So, what would be some examples of an upfit? Let's say I'm putting in a nail salon in a shopping center. What would be some examples of an upfit that the landlord might do for me to entice me? Ventilation, plumbing, right, for all the chairs and the foot bowls or whatever those things are called. I don't know what you call them. Right? I don't know what you call the little bathtubs at the end of the chairs. I don't fungus growth areas, is that what you call them? Stank water collection areas. Yeah, exactly. All right. That's it for chapter 11. That is it. All right, in chapter 12, the property management chapter, probably the most important thing in this whole chapter is that before tax cash flow formula. Remember that big long formula that gets you all the way down to before tax cash flow. What does it start with? What's at the top of that formula? Gross potential income, right? And gross potential income is the amount of rent we could possibly collect if the whole property was rented out and everybody was paying on time. That's gross potential. What do we subtract from gross potential? Vacancy and any collection losses. So basically anything that's vacant, any rent that's not paid, we subtract that out. And what does that give us? Gross effective income. Now, why is gross effective income important? What do we calculate based on gross effective income? The property management fee comes out of that. I love it when y'all can fire these answers back at me. The property management fee comes from that. What do we subtract from gross effective income? Operating expenses. And what are some examples of operating expenses? Maintenance, property taxes. What else? Landscaping. The property management fee would be an example of an operating expense. Marketing costs. How about insurance on the property? Utilities. Debt service. No. Debt service is not an operating expense. So once we've subtracted our operating expenses, what are we left with? Net operating income. And why is net operating income important? What does that help us calculate? The value of the property. Remember the income capitalization approach, that formula for valuing income producing properties? What kind of income's at the top of that T-bar? NOI, right? NOI is super important because that's how we figure the value of an income producing property. Is everybody good with that? And then what do we subtract out of NOI? Debt service, and that gets us to before tax cash flow. Okay? That formula, very important because obviously there's a couple different kinds of math you can't do unless you know that formula. One thing I would recommend to you, don't get bogged down on the test. If you get a question that deals with that formula, remember you can always plug answers back in. Right? I've had people get frustrated and they say, well, I didn't know, they were asking me how much rent somebody had to pay in order to give them this kind of cash flow. I'm like, well, did you ever think about plugging in the rent choices they gave you to see if, when you run it through the formula, if that's the cash flow you get at the bottom? Does everybody understand what I'm talking about there? So you can always reverse the question, plug their answer choices in and see what number works. Don't get bogged down on something like that. Okay? So outside of that formula in this chapter, what is the primary function of a property manager? Preserve the value while generating what? Some income. In fact, the best possible return on the property, right? Preserve the value and generate the best possible return on the property, subject to what the owner wants you to do. Of course, you got to follow the owner's instructions. What kind of agency or what kind of agent is a property manager? They are a general agent. They are a general agent. So what kinds of things can they do? What are some of their responsibilities? Maintenance, collecting rent, choosing tenants, selecting tenants, signing leases, negotiating leases. How about legal proceedings like summary ejectments? Is that their responsibility? Absolutely. Go ahead, John. Which would be what now? What? Depends on what you have a power of attorney for. If you have a power of attorney to do one specific task, what kind of agency would you have? General. If you have a POA to do anything for somebody, what kind of agency would you have? Universal. If you don't have any authority at all, what kind of agency would you have? Special. Okay? Not very special, right? Yeah, we're certainly special in every meaning of the word. Okay? Bless our hearts special. What about the property manager? Do they have the authority to make capital expenditures on the property or reinvest the profits or spend the profits in any way? No, that's outside of the domain of a property manager. Okay. Property managers are also responsible if they are managing, if they're managing a residential property or something like an apartment complex, for example. Do they have a responsibility for following the fair housing rules? Yes, absolutely they do. Do they have a responsibility for following the Americans with Disabilities Act if they're managing a place of public accommodation? If they're managing an apartment complex, which one do they have a responsibility to follow? Both of them. In the common areas, they've got to follow what? Which one? The ADA. In the common areas, they're going to follow the ADA, and within the units themselves, they're going to follow the fair housing laws. Everybody okay with that? Make sure you can do the math. Make sure you can calculate a property management fee. Make sure you can calculate net operating income before tax cash flow. That's it for Chapter 12.
We have to revisit this whole class again.
We have to do.
We got to do this in style.
What do you go over in for retest? You said that you have an evening of going over.
Same stuff.
Okay, so just redoing the thing.
Yep. That's it. That's it. Chapter 14. Chapter 14. And 14 and 15 I talk about at the same time. 13 is actually really something you don't have to worry too much about. You want to do chapter 13 real quick? Well, you want to, there might be something in there you need to cover. I can do it. It's going to be long, though. It's going to take me a long time. Leverage. What does the word leverage mean? What is leverage? It's borrowing money rather than using my own money. That's all leverage means. When I borrow money to purchase a property rather than spending my own cash and getting an advantage from that, what does a lever do? It gives you an advantage, right? You use a lever to lift something that you ordinarily would not be able to lift. That's what leverage means in a financial sense too. What does the term equity mean? Equity is the difference between what? What I owe and what it's worth. at any given time. The difference between what I owe and what it's worth at any given time. How do I build equity in property? What are some of the ways I can build equity? Pay down the mortgage because I owe less. I'm going to have more equity. Sure. Make improvements to the property because that's going to raise the value of the property. What else would change my equity position? Keep it longer, or the market could do what? The market could go up. The market could appreciate. Wouldn't that also increase my equity? So all of those things would increase my equity in a property. What's another word for return? Profit. Profit and return are the same thing. So a percent profit is the same thing as a percent return. Does that make sense? Everybody good on that? That's chapter 13. What is the profit formula? Okay. What goes on top of it's a T-bar. Profit, dollar profit goes on top, and what goes on the bottom? Help him out. What goes on the bottom in the profit formula? So those of you that are looking at me like I'm from outer space right now, I would suggest you pick up those little writing utensils you have in front of you and write down, I don't know the profit formula. So what's on top? Profit. And what's on the bottom? Investment and rate. That's the profit formula. So if I want to know the rate of profit, it's just going to be my dollar profit divided by my original investment. So in the case of if I bought it for this amount and I sold it for this amount, my original investment is going to be what I paid for it, right? What's my profit going to be? It's going to be the difference between what I paid for it. So, for example, I bought it for $100,000. I sold it for I bought it for $50,000. I sold it for $100,000. What's my profit? $50,000. What's my original investment? What's my original investment? $50,000. So it's going to be $50,000 divided by $50,000, which is what? What's 50,000 divided by 50,000? 1. But remember, when you're calculating a rate, you always multiply times 100. So what percent profit is that? 100%. Well, wouldn't that make sense if you had $50,000 profit and a $50,000 original investment? It's 100% profit. Okay? Everybody okay with that? Good. Chapter 14, and I'm kind of going to cover chapter 14 and 15 in one lump sum here. I may venture from one chapter to the other as I talk about some of these things. Remember, there are two parts to a mortgage. There is the note, the promissory note, and then there's what? The mortgage or the deed of trust. Some states it's called a mortgage. Some states it's called a deed of trust. Which one of those documents is not recorded? The promissory note. Which one is recorded? In North Carolina, it would be a deed of trust. And in some other states, it might be called a mortgage, right? The mortgage or the deed of trust is the collateral, the property. It's the promise of collateral. That's why it gets recorded, because it relates to the property. Now, North Carolina is what we call a title theory state. In a title theory state, how many parties are involved in the mortgage process? 3. The borrower, the lender, and who else? A trustee. Borrower, lender, trustee. That's why we call it a deed of trust in North Carolina. So the trustee has the right to do what? Foreclose. Take the property and do what with it? Sell it. Take the property and sell it at an auction in order to pay the lender for their lien. Yes? It does have to be sold in an auction. Yes. Yes.
So, you said the trustee does that, right?
The trustee does that. It's their job. They give the money to the lender from the sale.
Now, what if, like, you have real estate investors and they say, I purchase notes?
They purchase notes. So what is it when I buy a note? What is that? What's going on? I'm buying the mortgage. I'm buying the loan. Buying the loan. I'm not buying the property. I'm buying the loan. Which means Instead of owing the money to me, now they owe the money to you. If you buy a loan, you just take over responsibility for the payments. They're going to pay you now rather than who they were paying before. Okay? So, what do we call it? What kind of state do we call it when there's only two parties involved? That's a lien theory state. In a lien theory state, we have the borrower and the lender, right? That's it. And in a lien theory state, what kind of foreclosure do we have? Judicial foreclosure. In a title theory state, we have non-judicial foreclosure. Good. Good. All right. Just talked about that. On page 403, a couple of different things. What is a deficiency judgment?
Your house gets foreclosed on, and then they don't get enough in foreclosure to cover what you owe.
That's right. So the house is foreclosed on, the property is foreclosed on. The trustee takes the property, puts it for sale, sells it, and there's not enough money from the sale to pay the liens. So they can go after the person with a personal judgment. That's called a deficiency judgment. Does everybody understand what that is? We good on that one? I'm sorry? Because there wasn't enough to satisfy the note. That's exactly right. I owed $200,000 to Bank of America. The trustee took my property, sold it, and they only got $180,000 from the foreclosure sale. Bank of America, number one, did they take a loss for that $20,000? Yeah, that's what it means. They took a loss for that $20,000. Number two, could they come after me for a deficiency judgment for that $20,000? Absolutely. And they took a loss on it unless you had what kind of insurance? Not title insurance. Mortgage insurance. If there was mortgage insurance, remember that's what mortgage insurance does. Mortgage insurance covers the lender in the event you default on the loan and there's not enough money to cover. That's what mortgage insurance is for. Mortgage insurance would never pay off until after the foreclosure sale because we got to see what the loss actually is, if there is a loss. We don't know that there's a loss until after the foreclosure sale.
It only covers the gap, right?
It only covers a certain percentage of the original loan amount, exactly, which is usually the amount above 80% loan to value. What is a short sale on the bottom of page 403? It's a long process, yes. What's short about it? The money. The money's short. Specifically, the seller is upside down, right? I mean, isn't that the real root of a short sale? You've got a seller, a property owner, who wants to sell their property, except the home is not worth what they owe. That's a problem. That's only really a problem for us, though, if there's one more factor in play. Normally, if a seller is short, what do they do at closing? They bring money. So what's the last thing that has to click into place here for it to truly be a short sale? They don't have the money to bring. A short sale is when the property is upside down, you cannot sell it for what you owe on it, and the seller does not have any money to bring to closing. Is everybody good so far on that? Why does a lender agree to participate? And well, first of all, does the lender have to agree to participate? Can we go through with it if they don't agree, though? No, we can't. The lender's got to agree to this because the lender is doing what in a short sale? What's the lender saying? We'll take our loss right now and move on with our life. And why would they take that loss? If it's more than what they get in the foreclosure auction. That's exactly right. Because ultimately they know this thing is headed for foreclosure. That's the real key here. They ultimately know we're headed for foreclosure with this thing. Is everybody good with that? Okay. Do you think that'd be a material fact that we'd have to disclose if this was a short sale? Yes. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Good. What is an assumption? When you assume a loan, yes, I love it when you give me the same word right back. What's an assumption? It's when I assume something. Yeah? Yes, it is. It's a good answer. It's not going to get you off the hook, though. I'm taking over somebody else's loan, right? I am stepping into their shoes. I'm taking over their responsibilities under that loan. That is a short sale. I mean, an assumption. See, I don't even know what it is anymore. Lucky for me, I don't have to take a test on Tuesday. That is an assumption. Yeah, right. There's no curve in this thing. Page 409, note provisions. Okay, remember the promissory note is the IOU. It's the contract to repay the money. So it says how you're going to repay the money. You know, what's going to be the structure of my repayment. There are some different note provisions that you need to be familiar with in particular. Okay, what is an acceleration clause? I want it all now. The lender can declare they want it all right now. You don't have the right to make them payments anymore. And why did they have the right to declare they want it all right now? You're behind. You have defaulted. You're far enough behind that you're in default. And once you go into default, if there's an acceleration, if there wasn't an acceleration clause, could they call the whole thing due? No. So they put this in there to protect themselves. In the event you go in default, they want to be able to call the whole thing due right away. That's an acceleration clause. It accelerates the due date of the loan. Everybody good on that? What's an alienation clause? No assumptions, because what's true? What is alienation? Alienation, I heard somebody say it. Transferring title. Alienation is transferring title, right? So an alienation clause in a loan says if you transfer title, what do you have to do? Pay off the loan. An alienation clause in a loan would say you transfer title to somebody else, you got to pay the loan off, which would thereby prevent you from doing what? An assumption, because an assumption is transferring title without paying off the loan. Because who's going to take over the loan? The new buyer, right? But an alienation clause would prevent an assumption. So, go one step deeper. FHA loan, is it going to have an alienation clause in it? Why not? Because FHA loans are what? They're assumable. Not only are they government backed, but they're assumable. You need to make that connection. You got to plug it in. The receptacle's here, the cord's here. You got to plug the two of them together, right? All government-backed loans are assumable, right? So, would government-backed loans have an alienation clause in them? They would? What does an alienation clause prevent? You have to pay off the loan, so you can't assume something that has an alienation clause. So would government-backed loans, FHA, VA, USDA, would they have an alienation clause? They would not, because an alienation clause would prevent assumption, and these are fully assumable loans. Does that make sense for everybody? Okay. I know that some of this stuff is tough with these provisions, but you got to know them. Okay.
Watch out. Travis,
Yes.
when you stop, be careful.
There we go.
You got one of those moments.
We're gonna have like a Wile E. Coyote type moment here, you know, a Looney Tunes moment. Oh God, a Home Alone moment. I don't need any buckets in the face. Thanks very much. All right, page 410. We call the principal and interest payment what? Debt service. Debt service is just that principal and interest payment. So make sure that you can do the math of dealing with a principal and interest payment. We talked about that I'm not going to do math tonight because we've already talked about that, but make sure you're comfortable with calculating a loan balance after a payment, for example. Okay? How to reduce a loan balance after a single payment, for example. Make sure you're good with that. What's a loan to value ratio? It's the percentage of the value of the property that you're what? That you're borrowing. The percentage of the value of the property that you are borrowing. So an 80% loan-to-value ratio means you're borrowing what? 80% of the value of the property. Okay? 80% of the value of the property. That's what a loan-to-value ratio is. On page 412, discount points. What is a discount point? Prepaid interest. That's a good place to start. It's prepaid interest. When do you pay it? At closing. So up front, right? It lowers the what? Interest rate. But because you're paying a fee, it also increases the lender's yield. So it lowers your rate and increases their yield. Okay, that's the purpose of a discount point. How much does a discount point cost? 1% of the loan amount. And how much does it change the rate, the interest rate? 1/8%, which is 0.125, however you want to remember it. 1/8% or 0.1825. Okay? The term amortization just means paying a loan down over time, right? That's what amortization means. Paying the balance down over time. What does fully amortized mean? What do you owe at the end of a fully amortized loan? 0. Your payment is big enough so that at the end of the loan you owe 0. What does partially amortized mean? You've paid it down, but you haven't paid it down to 0, so you're going to have what kind of payment at the end? Balloon payment. What is an interest-only or term loan? Bad idea. There you go. You only pay interest. I'm sorry?
When you sell it,
Right. At the end of the loan, you still owe the full balance. Your balloon payment is the original amount you borrowed. Okay? Is everybody good on those? Good. What's an adjustable rate mortgage? Your interest rate could fluctuate. It could go up or down. Why do you take out an adjustable rate mortgage generally? Because the lower payment comes with a lower rate, at least initially, right? The initial interest rate, they sometimes call it the teaser rate for a reason, is going to be lower than a fixed rate loan. All right, that takes care of chapter 14. 15. Let's go. Yeah, I'm going to make sure I haven't missed anything in 15 here. Okay. What's the difference between the primary mortgage market and the secondary mortgage market? So primary mortgage market is where loans are made. Secondary mortgage market is where they are sold. Good. Good. Why do we sell them on the secondary market? To do what? Free up money so the banks have more money to lend. If they sell a loan, they have money back in their pockets, they can lend again. It just keeps money flowing, right? Who's the biggest buyer on the secondary market? Fannie Mae. Exactly. Fannie Mae is. What is a conventional loan? On page 432. It's what? Fannie Mae will buy it, but what's the defining characteristic? There's one thing that's the first thing that you could say. It's the most definitive thing about a conventional loan. It starts with the word not. It is not government-backed. A conventional loan is one that has no government backing. Now, government backing is a fancy way of saying government mortgage insurance, right? That's what government backing is. It's mortgage insurance. Could a conventional loan have mortgage insurance? Yes, it just didn't come from who? From the government. It just didn't come from the government. Conventional loans could have mortgage insurance, but it's mortgage insurance that comes from private companies, not from the government. We call it private mortgage insurance. The FHA, VA, USDA loan programs, those are all the government-backed loans. What is sort of the defining characteristic of them? Other than being government-backed, what kind of makes you know you're looking at, or why do people go to FHA loans, VA loans, USDA loans? High loan-to-value ratio. That is the defining characteristic of a government-backed loan. Think of it. FHA is a 97% loan-to-value. USDA is 100% loan-to-value. VA is 100%. Most conventional loans are going to be down in the 80s and 90s. as far as loan to value ratios. So the defining characteristic of a government-backed loan is that high loan to value ratio. Does the government set interest rates? No. Who sets the interest rates on these government-backed loans? The banks do. Does the government lend the money? No. Who lends the money? The banks do. What does the government actually provide? Insurance. The government insures the loans for loss, right? It's mortgage insurance. It's just not private mortgage insurance. Private mortgage insurance would be on what kind of loans? Conventional loans. Government-backed loans have government mortgage insurance on them. Okay, is everybody good on that distinction? You do not need to know all the different types of FHA loan programs on page 435. Who is eligible for a VA loan? Veterans and their qualifying spouses. Good. Veterans and their qualifying spouses. One thing I would say you should know about VA loans in particular, it's the one loan type where the borrower is not allowed to pay more than the appraised value. It's the only loan where the borrower cannot choose to pay more than the appraised value. If I get a conventional loan and the property doesn't appraise, I can just pay the difference in cash. If I get an FHA loan and the property doesn't appraise, I can pay the difference in cash. If I get a VA loan and the property doesn't appraise, the sale stops. Either the seller has to reduce to the appraised value or the contract has to be terminated. You cannot close that loan if it doesn't appraise.
The book says the veteran may either pay the difference in cash.
That's what I thought.
They cannot.
Can you scratch that out?
Is it talking about the cap in that point?
I'm sorry?
Because there's a cap, it's like $400 and something $1,000 if it's.
That's the entitlement cap. But what I would say that you need to recognize is that when you have a VA loan, they can't pay over that appraised amount. Okay? So appraisal becomes a big deal with VA loans. I'm not.
Will sellers sometimes not take it if they know it's a VA loan?
They will. For that reason, if they think it won't appraise. His question was basically, is that going to limit, what sellers would be willing to accept as far as VA loans? Yes, absolutely. Because they know there's that danger. Okay. On page 439, a purchase money mortgage. That's a fancy terminology for what kind of loan? Seller financing. Make sure you understand seller financing. Make sure it's not one of those bobblehead things that you look at me and go, oh yeah. No. What's happening with seller financing? Is the borrower getting a loan? Is the buyer getting a loan? From who? The seller. Other than that, it's a normal transaction. Who is title being transferred to? The buyer. It's just a normal transaction, except the loan comes from the seller. So the seller walks away from the closing with some cash, but not all the cash, because they've loaned some of it right back to the buyer. Sometimes we'll say that, refer to it as taking back a note. If you ever see that, the seller took back a note. That just means seller financing. Okay? That is very different from an installment land contract. What is an installment land contract?
You pay and then you don't get the
You don't get title as the buyer until what happens? Until you have completely paid it off. Whereas with seller financing, are you going to walk away from that closing with the title? Yes. You're going to get the deed at closing. With an installment land contract, you're not going to get a deed transferred over to you until what happens? Until you've made every single payment. That's an installment land contract. So who does that advantage? The buyer or the seller? The seller. The seller, big time. Under residential lending practices on page 441, end of page 442, make sure you are familiar with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And I know they don't mention it right here, but I'm going to mention it here so I don't make sure I don't forget it later. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act deals with borrowing money, right? Does it have some protected classes just like the Fair Housing Act does? Are they different protected classes? Yes. What are the protected classes under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act? Well, let's get the first 5 out of the way because they're the same as they are fair housing, right? Race, color, religion, national origin, sex. Same first 5. But the last 2 are different. What are they? Age and marital status. Age and marital status. You better make sure you know which act these are protected under and which act they're not protected under. Age and marital status are protected under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which means you're protected against discrimination based on your age if you're doing what? Getting a loan. Are you protected against discrimination based on your age if you want to rent a house or buy a house? No, because it's not protected under fair housing, but it is protected under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Okay? So make sure you know those protected classes. Race, color, religion, national origin, sex. Those are the first 5 in both acts, whether it's fair housing or equal credit. What are the last 2 in equal credit? Age and marital status. What are the last 2 in fair housing? Familial status and handicapping status. Those are the last 2 in fair housing. First 5 are the same. So what do you think they're going to test you on? The last 2. It's too easy if they test you on the first 5 because it's the same on both sides.
What is fair housing again?
Race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, handicapping status. Fresh corn, no vowels. Right? Fresh corn. All right. Over on page 445, finance legislation. The Truth in Lending Act and Regulation Z of the Truth in Lending Act. Regulation Z deals with advertising loans. How many points are there on the letter Z? 4. That means when I'm advertising a loan, how many disclosures do I have to make? 4. And what are they? APR, finance charges, payment, each payment, the total of all the payments, right? And the amount I'm borrowing, the amount financed. Those are the 4 things. The APR, the finance charges,
Number of payments.
the payment amount and the total number of all the payments, right? And the amount I'm financing. Those are the 4 things I would have to disclose if I'm advertising a loan. So, the question is, when am I advertising a loan? That's the question. When I use a number that relates to what? A loan. Now, you can't just, listen, they ain't going to make it so easy to say a number. That's pretty dang easy, right? You know, it's got to be a number related to what? A loan. There are plenty of numbers that you can use, like the list price of a house. Is that a trigger term? No. The amount of the amount of property taxes due annually on the property. Is that a trigger term? The amount of the monthly HOA dues. Is that a trigger term? No. The amount of a monthly payment. Is that a trigger term? An interest rate. Is that a trigger term? Yes. The loan to value ratio. Is that a trigger term? Yes. All of those things would be trigger terms. Payment amounts. All of that stuff would be a trigger term. Okay? Which means you have got to give those disclosures. And that is Regulation Z of the Truth in Lending Act. All right? Everybody good? Oh, and there's the Equal Credit Opportunity Act on page 446. I was just a page ahead. All right? We good on 15? I don't like quick questions. I like long questions.
If they're saying in the book, it's saying if the number, if there's a number in the advertising, you need to disclose the full points.
The four.
So if there is a number of the loan,
a number related to a loan.
Right. You have to
Right.
disclose everything.
You have to disclose the APR, right? The amount financed, the total of all the payments, and all the finance charges. Those are the 4 things. If you use a trigger term, which is a number related to the loan. Okay? Good on that? I think that's it for chapter 15. All right, let's take a quick break and then we will come back